organizing committee here at the conference. I'm really excited to have with us two people that have open source at heart, but also at least two that are with large organizations that have invested time and effort in making a mark. From the software side, we have Andrew Ross, who's a director of ecosystem development at the Eclipse Foundation. And we have Miriam Ayaz from CERN, that's the European Union Research Center, I think.
European Organization for Nuclear Research.
For nuclear research, they are getting right, wrong. And the one interesting thing about CERN, and the reason why she's here is that CERN is one of the very large organizations that has adopted open source hardware development and licensing, and that has developed also a model on how to license and use that form of open source. She's a legal counsel for technology transfer there, and she will be also talking to us about that new type of development. And the session is going to be chaired and directed mainly by Thomas Prowse, who's a lawyer in Ottawa. And he has his own law firm right now, but also he has extensive experience in helping out open source and companies in Ottawa in the technology sector, and pretty much in many areas internationally, on how to deal with intellectual property and the challenges to that. So that being said, I would like to welcome Thomas and the committee.
Okay. Thanks, Alfredo, for the introduction. Yeah, I work for a very small organization. It's me. Today what we're going to do is, well, first of all, any presentation by lawyers have to start with disclaimers. So, it's general information, it's not professional legal advice, and the views being expressed are those of individuals. And if it were my presentation alone, there'd be a third bullet that said, these views are not necessarily those of any reasonable person. In terms of the agenda, we're going to quickly go through what's open source, why open source software matters to the IEEE, and then Alfredo will be back to run through some of the specifics. Talk about open source software, hardware. We're going to talk about health, and I'll explain what that is. And then hopefully about the last half of the session is going to be walking through some aspects of successful open source projects with a particular focus on governance. And then, well, I've got a Q&A session. I think given the topic and the size of the room, assuming that we're on track time-wise, I think we can probably take questions as we go along. I think that would work well. Okay, what's open source? I like to say my informal one is, open source, i.e. Firefox software or the Arduino board, is to proprietary Internet Explorer or some of these proprietary boards what Wikipedia is to Encyclopedia Britannica. And depending on the age of the population I'm presenting to, the last one can be entirely, I don't know what that is. It's going to soon be like Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. You'll have to make some reference to something like that. I also like to think of open source software and hardware as an example of common sourcing. So what do I mean by common sourcing? Well, I'll explain it. I'll go, if you bear with me, through basically different pillars, talking tragedy of the commons, talk about an iCommons, basically open source software methodologies, and then I'll get back to tell you what I think common sourcing is. Fundamentally, one of the great social science paradigms is the tragedy of the commons, and it's based on an article back in 1968. I think, by way of confession, my oldest brother is an electrical engineer, so I think he'll be proud of me to be actually presenting here, but he'll also be a bit embarrassed because I'm talking social science. In that article, he postulates a commons pasture that's open to all, so, a traditional pasture, and he examines the position of a commons herdman who is making a decision as to whether he's going to add an animal to the land, this common pasture. And so Arden, as we know, all farmers are very good at applying utility models. So he goes through an analysis that as a herdsman, if he adds the animal, he's going to get the full benefit of the animal plus one. Yet the cost, the incremental cost to the commons pasture will be shared equally across all the other animals and herdsmen. And so he will only bear minus 1 divided by n of the costs. So therefore, being a rational herdsman, he makes the calculation the net utility is to add an animal, and another animal, and all the other herdsmen are making similar calculations. So when we come to my really fancy graphic, it happens something like this. I spent a lot of time doing that at one point. I'm very proud of it. And so, in the word of Hardens, in a commons, essentially we're all doomed. The ruin is the destination that we all rush to in the context of a commons. So this is, a very pervasive paradigm and analogy that is really the reason that social scientists drink. I think engineers drink for different reasons. Okay, what is an iCommons? An iCommons, I think, is really information, a shared pool of information. And so unlike the physical commons, information is not subject to physical constraint. That as you share information, it's not consumed, unlike the grass in the pasture. And so if we go back to the Harden paradigm and we replace, the cost-benefit equation is fundamentally altered, as we'll see. And so in the absence of scarcity, I argue that the tragedy of the commons actually becomes the treasury of the iCommons. So pillar number 3, what's open source software methodology? I think open source is probably the earliest and best example of really an operating iCommons. I also think that, while it's daunting to distill, what are the fundamental principles underlying open source development? I think number 1 is development's best done as a collaborative activity. I think that optimal collaboration requires the open sharing of information across broad and diverse communities of interest. And that sharing must be done in ways that preserve those fundamental freedoms. And as we'll touch on in Andrew's presentation, this sharing these freedoms are reflected under different types of licenses. And you have either the permissive licenses and then the reciprocal licenses, which we'll discuss in some detail. So back to what is the common sourcing? I think returning to the Harden utility model once, for example, let's talk about really the position of the herdsman who's making a decision about the iCommons. If they kind of contribute, add value to valuable information to the iCommons, all of the people who are tapping into the commons get the benefit. So the cost or the contribution of the information is +1 times n. But since the information is really not subject to scarcity, the average cost to each person, assuming they contribute equally, is their fractional share of the overall cost. So fundamentally, once again calculating the net utilities, it's rational to actually be both a contributor and user to an iCommons. And so in my terminology, when I talk about common sourcing, I talk about really the iCommons pooling of shared information and some physical resources under open source methodologies. And I think that common sourcing is really underlying, is kind of a driver of new and emerging social and business models for the creation of value. And I think that's one of the reasons, IEEE is looking at it. There are fundamentally different ways of collaborating and creating value. And in terms of what I'm going to do now quickly is go through what are some of the elements of an open source project. Because I think that one of our main objectives that we share is to come here and talk about what are some of the foundational or kind of plumbing requirements for an open source project. Obviously there has to be some particular project, typically some piece of technology, whether it's hardware, software, or both. There needs to be communities of interest, both to contribute to it and then ultimately the users. But then there's a lot of other stuff, and we'll actually return in the second half of the talk to go through these in more detail. But just to give you a bit of a perspective, fundamentally around a project there will be a founder, the founder of the project. There will also be, the initial seed contribution. In many cases, the project might be built around, say a commercial organization that sees an opportunity to release a portion of its code to the community. It may be an individual who's been working on a piece of code, thinks that there's some value in it, is going to make that available. In conjunction with that, it's critical to understand, okay, what's the project about? What are the objectives? What are we trying to do? Then I think flowing out of that, once you have a better understanding of your objectives, that's when a pretty good point to have a discussion about, well, what type of license are we going to use for the project? And we'll be discussing a range of projects for both software and hardware. And then what are some of the intellectual property models and issues? How are we going to address kind of the ownership structure around contributions? Then there's the issue of contributors and contribution agreements. How are we going to, based on our intellectual property model, if the view is a project is going to own the intellectual property in the project, how are we going to ensure that there are necessary agreements in place to achieve that? There's a lot of infrastructure. I think both Andrew and Marion can talk to, you can have a project, but there's a lot of other stuff around the project, and we'll touch on that as well. And then there's often broadly an issue that the founder may not necessarily be the owner longer term. As we know in a startup economy, a lot of people who are good at starting companies are not necessarily the best people to run the company. So similarly, I think for projects, is often an open source project will face that point of, okay, who takes over for the founder? What's the ownership model going to be? And then also, what's the community, and actually what are the communities, both of contributors and users, that we need to be thinking about? So that's kind of a quick overview of what's open source software. And then what I think fundamentally pulls all of these themes together, and what we'll spend some time on, is just fundamentally the issue of governance. Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of these considerations just fall into the day-to-day operation, management structure of a project. And Alfredo, why don't you come back up to why open source kind of matters to the IEEE. These are a series of slides that Alfredo kind of put together, and I think you can probably highlight some aspects of the open source.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. So, IEEE, about 5 years ago, they started this project. I've been working on humanitarian challenges and situations, and see how technology could help in those situations. And they've thought since of using open source, an open source model, and open source design to make the designs available and the solutions available to everybody, so that more people can benefit from that. Just before I talk about that, is for those that are within IEEE, that if you're here at this conference, probably you understand the value of IEEE and how IEEE has addressed many of the needs of humanity through all these projects. But I just wanted to point out, if you were to look at IEEE and its core values, you will see that service to humanity, which is the first of the 8 core values, it has been there for many, many years. So IEEE has been doing humanitarian type of development for many years in different forms. One of them is through publications, through conference proceedings, and the research and work of many of the IEEE volunteers that benefit from the standards and all the technical activities that IEEE facilitates. But more directly, the way IEEE has been doing humanitarian for the recent history can be traced back to the tsunami that happened in India, on the east coast of India, back in 2006, I think it was. And at that time, the Kerala section in the southern part of India, when they heard that the tsunami had happened, they decided to just drive over to the other side of India and see how they could help. At the time, one of the people involved was Rajan, and he was the chair of the section. His wife and his best friend went over there, Satish is his friend, and they got there, and they were one of the first people that got to that part of India. And then they saw that nobody else was there, so they said, okay, let's get organized, let's see how we can help. So they set up in a small cabin, they started writing down the names of people that would show up and looking for relatives, and they started writing this down on a paper, and they said, no, better use a database. So they created a small database and went back and got a computer, connected that together, and once they had set that up in a small Wi-Fi network in that, they were, it was the organization, the health organizations arrived. And when they saw that they already had a small database and some data, they said, oh, we're going to make our headquarters right here. And why I mention that is that the type of humanitarian effort that I actually have been doing for the most, it is to address a need from a community where technology can be used. So other organizations do humanitarian work. Some of it is by enlisting volunteers to go overseas for 6 months, 18 months, and work with the communities overseas. Some other people raise money, fundraising. IEEE tries to do it in conjunction with a local organization, use technology in a way that will address a specific need. Right now, SITE has many groups, mostly in that region, but they're growing rapidly in South America, and now the plan is to grow in other places. And the activities that these new groups are trying to do is to inspire, which is inviting you here and presenting all this work that IEEE is doing so that you're inspired yourself and interested in participating. Enabling, meaning that having travel grants, some networking with experts in the field so that we can connect you with what would enable you to do the work and participate yourself. And connecting, which is holding activities like this one for you to meet others who seem like interesting to get involved. Now, the focus of the IEEE humanitarian projects is to lead you to a project and actually implementing a solution that will be deployed. And one of the models where we have adopted is the one that Ray Larson presented earlier for the project system and identification and sustainable type of developments and deployments. Now, the one thing that I wanted to mention before talking about the projects is that if you look at the overall efforts of IEEE, this cycle, what humanitarian efforts that IEEE is doing, it's just one of the many things that they do. So it's not one of the main focuses of IEEE, but it's one that is growing and that interests more and more people within IEEE and outside of IEEE because of the capabilities IEEE does. So if you're familiar with IEEE, you would see that this cycle for the humanitarian work, even the PS, which is here, is one of the only groups that has connections with one of the pillars of IEEE, which is the Activities Board, that has all the technical societies. And then you have some educational activities that happen like this, and ethics, that are some of the projects that are ongoing for IEEE that are mainly catered to students. And at the top we have the other services that engage members directly, and offering like the section meetings, the region meetings, and the geographical structure of IEEE. But the humanitarian work that IEEE is trying to do now, following that first example from the tsunami in India, where we would like groups at IEEE to collaborate with an organization that has a specific need that is still evolving and trying to fit into the overall picture of IEEE. Now, I mentioned briefly about this project back in 2008-2009. That was the Humanitarian Technology Challenge. At the time, IEEE did this experiment where they provided funding for groups that were willing to create solutions in 3 areas: electricity, electrification, data connectivity, and health record. Out of those ones, I think the one product that has led the way and that has shown how this would work, it is the product that CSI is still working on. Now, what does it mean to you, and where is the need for licensing, and where does open source fit in the whole picture? So I just briefly, like I said, 2009, IEEE said that they wanted to do humanitarian work using technology, and that so that technology would be shared with everybody using open source methods. we'll be seeing here from the other speakers and from Thomas what that means. And Thomas already introduced what is the concept of open source. Since other organizations have gotten organized, like in Canada we have this HIC committee, and there is a methodology now understood by most members that are involved with humanitarian at IEEE, which is the IDE 90 model, which is we ask volunteers to come up with an idea, to incubate it. We ask them to demonstrate how that would work with a partner organization. Then later on, we ask them to educate with that partner in a community that benefit from that. And through that process, there are many transfers of knowledge, and also not only the knowledge and how to use it, but also the design itself and the implementation and details so that they can service it. And along with that, yes, you can do it in a way where you would do general training and just say it and communicate that. But if you want to create wealth and value in a way to have wealth creation and benefiting people as they develop socioeconomically, you want to have a way to identify what that thing is that you transfer, so that people know, okay, this is what I got from IEEE, this is my input, and now when I go and build upon that, this is what I'm building, these are my basics. If I need to go and get a loan from a bank, I need to be able to tell them, I got this from IEEE, this is what that is, so this is the intellectual property of the knowledge or the training that I got, this is the equipment that I got from them, it is an IEEE design, and here is what I want to move on from that. And at the moment, they have efforts to do that, but only are very coordinated way from across the IEEE, from multiple places from IEEE. So, and here are some of the projects, and with these I'll just present some of them so that you know what they are, and then from here on you get the information from the speakers on ways you may want to frame this development so that it has a major impact on the needs of those people that IEEE is trying to help. So the Community Solutions Initiative started in Haiti. Now they're also deploying systems in Africa, in 3 countries in Africa. And they started under the HPC effort, and now it's under the Power and Energy Society. And of course, they align themselves with the United Nations Millennium Development Goals and in trying to address poverty. And that is why they have a link to making sure that people can make money out of using the solution by way of franchises and a business model that would make